Welcome to Changing Higher Ed, a podcast dedicated to helping higher education leaders improve their institutions. With your host, Dr. Drumm McNaughton, CEO of The Change Leader, a consultancy that helps higher ed leaders holistically transform their institutions. Learn more at changinghighered.com. And now, here's your host, Drumm McNaughton.
Thank you, David. Our guest today is Brian Kelly, a virtual Chief Information Security Officer for Compass IT Compliance. In his role as a virtual CISO, Brian supports the safeguarding of information assets across multiple verticals against unauthorized use, disclosure, modification, damage, or loss by developing, implementing, and maintaining methods to provide a secure and stable environment for his clients' data and related systems. Before joining Compass, Brian was the CISO for Quinnipiac University and most recently the Cybersecurity Program Director at EDUCAUSE. He joins us again today to talk about the recent MOVEit hack, third-party risk, and the Connecticut Cyber Hub, which is a model for training more cyber professionals. Brian, welcome to the show, or I should say welcome back to the show.
Glad to be back. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thank you for coming back. This is going to be fun. There's so much stuff going on in cyber right now. But before we jump into that, if you wouldn't mind for our guest, just giving folks a little bit of background on who you are and how you got here.
Yeah, it's been a little bit of time since I've been here, so I'll remind the listeners that I've had a long career in higher education cybersecurity. I started way back in 2006 as the Chief Information Security Officer for Quinnipiac University. I did that through 2019. I left Quinnipiac to go be the cybersecurity director at EDUCAUSE. Did that through the pandemic and left EDUCAUSE about a year ago to go back from sort of being a coach and a consultant to being a player in a role as a virtual CISO for a consultancy here in the Northeast, supporting both higher education clients and other verticals, including biopharma and manufacturing and software. So I can't get away from cybersecurity. There's so much to do, and I'm really enjoying sort of being back on the field doing cyber.
How did you get into cyber?
That's $1 million question. I wanted to be a police officer. So way back when I started a career at a community college, an academic career at a community college in a criminal justice program. I finished that program and I talked to an Air Force recruiter. You know the joke about how do you know when your recruiter is lying to you? When their lips are moving, right? So they convinced me to take a computer operator position in the Air Force that came with a top secret clearance. And it was probably the best lie I've ever been told. That moved me into computer security for the military. I did that through most of the 90s. Then I left the military full-time to go work for Aetna, doing similar work around cybersecurity and information security between 2000 and 2006 when I went to Quinnipiac. So it all goes back to that Air Force recruiter that shifted me from police work to cybersecurity.
Well, thank heavens for little lies, right?
Right, yeah. Sometimes one door closes, another door opens, right? You don't necessarily see those opportunities at face value initially.
Well, as I see you, I don't see you as a policeman. I think you're exactly where you need to be.
Thank you. I've heard that a lot, and a lot of that came from my father, who was a policeman for his career, and that's where my desire to follow his footsteps came from. And all along my career path, he would say the same thing. He would say, "Just you're better off where you are. This is where you're supposed to be."
You're policing different things,
right? Exactly. It's very similar without maybe the danger and the exposure.
Although sometimes lately they've been sending bombs through the internet. No, I'm just kidding.
Yeah,
let's not give many ideas.
The kinetic effect. No, we're not far off from right. What kinetic effect you can have via the internet? It's happening.
Oh, that's scary. We'll have to talk about that offline.
Yeah.
So let's go back to cyber. From bombs. I've been reading too many novels lately, I think. Yeah. We've been seeing a lot of news about the cyber world lately. What's been going on?
So everything's going on. And I think, as you've said, we're seeing more interest from our leadership within higher education, our presidents and our boards around it, simply because there is so much in the news around it. Recently, we've seen the National Student Clearinghouse has had an incident that was part of a third-party breach or an incident that impacted them, which is having a downstream impact on many higher eds, as the National Student Clearinghouse is a organization that many of our higher ed institutions use. And when we think about those type of risks specifically, we call them sort of third-party risks. So all of our colleges and universities that are engaged with the National Student Clearinghouse are sharing data, and the NSC, the National Student Clearinghouse, is using a third-party application. In this case, it was called MOVEit. Ironically, careful what you name your application, right? The application was called MOVEit to help you move large pieces of data. That application was compromised, and as such, institutional data was compromised. So those notices just started going out within the last couple of days. And it's important, I think, in the context of sort of understanding what that third-party risk is for our institutions.
Well, that's huge. I've read about the MOVEit incidents that are going on. I did not realize it affected the National Student Clearinghouse.
Right. And I think that's when we look at sort of a consumer level or a layman's perspective around, we see these things in the news, right? The MOVEit vulnerability. Then we have to take that and say, okay, does our institution use that product or that service? Are we at risk? Do we need to patch? Do we need to go and update our environment to protect us from the MOVEit environment? And we do that. I think institutions are very good about doing that. But in this case, it's a third party. It's the NSC that was, right? So this is where it's super important when we see those type of vulnerabilities, those type of exploits being reported, that while we do the sort of the triage and the assessments internally, that we're also starting a process to reach out to all of the vendors and the contractors that our institutions work with to ask, do you use the MOVEit product? What are you doing to protect our data that we've shared with you if you are using that? And MOVEit's just one example, right? If you think of all of the different pieces of software that every company is using, it becomes really important to have a process in place for going out and vetting sort of the risk around the third parties that we engage with.
Well, I am a complete neophyte when it comes to this. So help me understand. Many folks are using the cloud for data storage. I mean, Amazon, Google, there's so many different ones out there that they can use. Is this MOVEit tool used to take data from Joe University or Mary's University and to put it up in the cloud?
Yeah, I think it, conceptually, right, you can use it to move data from what would traditionally be your on-premise data center to the cloud. It really is at the heart of it, it's a file transfer service that moves files from one location to another, whether that's across an institution or from cloud to cloud. We talk about the cloud, and many institutions are sort of cloud first now with AWS, with Google, with Microsoft Azure. Certainly those environments have more security and more capability than some of the on-prem capabilities that we have at our institutions. But it does come back to configuration and making sure that we're not just sort of willy-nilly putting things into the cloud, that we're making sure that we are securing those environments. And again, understanding what software is being used both on-premise and in our clouds to make sure that they're not vulnerable.
Mm-hmm. I break it down to something simple for me to understand. Like a colleague of mine had a website or has a website that got hacked. The software for the site had not been updated multiple times. There were multiple security vulnerabilities. And they came in and they were loading porn videos. This website was ranked number 13 on Google for porn videos. That's probably, if you're consulting to U.S. government entities, that's probably not the thing that you want to be known for.
No, and I think that's you're spot on. Is sort of the patching, right? So something that we've talked about for years of sort of, we're all familiar with our Windows or our Mac operating system patches, but if you think of every application potentially has vulnerabilities, right? So one, you're looking for, are you doing vulnerability management at your friend's company or at your institutions? Do you have a program where you're programmatically scanning for what are those vulnerabilities? Are there patches that can be applied to mitigate those vulnerabilities? Or are there other compensating controls that can be put in place, firewalls or other types of things that can help prevent the hackers from installing files or malware or hosting videos on your site and using it in a way that's not intended? So again, a lot of that is having process and policies in place to go out and do that work. And small businesses are not alone, and that your friend probably didn't have those resources or awareness, right? Just sort of knowing what to do is hugely important.
Mm-hmm. Which is why universities, colleges should have a CISO who understands these things, correct?
Absolutely. So that chief information security officer role is, I think we're at an inflection point where most higher eds have that role now. And that's something that we talked about with the Department of Education's federal student aid initiatives around the Gramm-Leach-Bliley Act. That's the first element of compliance with those changes is to designate a responsible individual, qualified individual at your institution, which is typically the CISO. It could be a director of information security or some person, but having that responsible person is now a requirement if the institution wants to continue to receive student aid.
And that's huge. It's long overcoming. I know the corporate side has been doing this for a long period of time, but for a higher ed institution to come in and do it, as much data as they have, I think it makes really good sense.
Absolutely. And it's the way they're viewing the colleges and universities now is as you're a financial institution. You're like a bank or any other credit or loan type agency, and you're going to be held to the standards around those requirements in the same way.
That's good. Now, let's go back to third-party risk a little bit. This is all, it's like a computer. Everything is linked together, and if you don't have the right patches, you're in trouble. Before we came on the air, we talked a little bit about tools that universities can use to see how much risk there is.
Absolutely. And one of the ones that's near and dear to my heart is the HECVAT. And when we say the HECVAT, everybody's first question is, what the heck, right? What the HECVAT?
What the heck is the HECVAT?
It's such an ugly acronym that it's beautiful, right? So it's in its 6th year now. It was developed in partnership with EDUCAUSE and Internet2 and the community of higher education practitioners. And the acronym stands for the Higher Education Community Vendor Assessment Toolkit. Initially, the C stood for cloud, because to your point, everyone was moving their data to the cloud, and we wanted to make sure institutionally that we were looking at the risk of those cloud applications. But it became something that was being used universally for vetting all third-party applications that were used within a higher ed institution. But the acronym HECVAT had sort of grown legs, and we didn't want to change. So we thought about, how do we change the C to something that's more inclusive without changing the acronym? So it became the community. And I think that really reflected that it's for the community, but it's also built by the community. And what that does, it provides a standard set of questions that institutions can ask those third-party vendors around security, around privacy. And most recently, there's been some accessibility questions that have been added to the HECVAT. It's on version 3.04, the third version of this questionnaire. And EDUCAUSE and the community have over 150 colleges and universities that are using that as a questionnaire in their procurement process. We know that large vendors like Microsoft and Google have completed it. So what that allows for is that we're all sort of asking the same questions around that risk, and we're all getting the same answers, right? So it makes it easier for the vendors. They're not answering bespoke questionnaires from 150 different colleges and universities where there might be nuanced differences to it. So it sort of makes it easier on the vendor side, but it also allows the community of CISOs, of cybersecurity and privacy practitioners in higher ed to be able to have a conversation around a grounded, standardized set of questions. So again, it's really to help, to your point, evaluate the risk of all of these entanglements is probably the wrong word, but all of the things that help us, enable us to work within higher ed, right? We're not a one system institution anymore. We've got so many different systems that are our student information system, our ERP system, our CRM, right? How do we vet the security of all of those consistently?
And even simple stuff like ordering a Coca-Cola. You've got to have a system to be able to do that.
Right. What do we say? There's an app for that now. We used to call to order a pizza. Now we can use an app, or even Starbucks, maybe, right? We can order our coffee online. We don't have to talk to a human being.
Which, just talking about these third-party devices, people bringing their own computers in, their own cell phones, connecting to your Wi-Fi, that creates headaches too, doesn't it?
Yeah, and I think higher ed has probably been further along in that BYOD, bring your own device environment for maybe 5 to 7 years, even pre-pandemic, where we had our students, faculty, and staff doing that long before sort of it was an accepted practice in corporate America. There's still some reluctance in the corporate world to allow employees to bring their own or use their own devices, their mobile devices, their own computers. But I think higher ed, we had to be able to enable that securely. So I do think there's risk there, but you absolutely have to sort of be aware of it in order to address it.
Mm-hmm. Let's swap horses a little bit.
Oh, absolutely.
GLBA, Gramm-Leach-Bliley Act, just came about to protect student information for federal financial aid. What is it? What are the implications?
So, largely the implications went into effect early June of 2023. So the final rule, so the Federal Trade Commission enacted changes for standards around safeguarding customer information, the safeguards rule as we think about it. That went into effect way back in December 9th of 2021. So here we are, midsummer of 2023, where it is now a requirement that higher education institutions meet the elements of those rule changes. And as we talked about, the primary rule change really is having that responsible person. You must designate a responsible, qualified individual. So there's sort of 9 elements within these rule changes that are really important for institutions to be aware of and to make sure they're tracking. The second one being that you're having a risk assessment performed at least annually, so that you're having either a third party or you're doing that internally, where you're evaluating around the risk that federal student aid data within your institution specifically. And then there's a number of controls that go in around access review. So are you vetting that the employees within your institution, the people that are granted access to that information, are you reviewing annually that the access hasn't changed, that people haven't been added? You want to make sure that you know where that data is, that you've identified all that data that's coming in. Standards around encryption, making sure that the data is being protected, is being encrypted both in rest, when it's being stored, whether on-prem or in the cloud, and also in transit when it's being used.
When you say on-prem, you mean on-premise, right?
Yeah, on-premise. Yeah, and if you have a data center on campus, yeah. Sorry, no, it's the geek in me. So no worries. Yeah, and then making sure if you're doing anything development-wise, if you're coding or developing any of the software at your institution that interacts with that Department of Education data, that you're following secure coding practices. We also talk a lot about life cycles, right? So in these controls, that data disposal, how are we securely disposing of data that we should no longer have, that's aged out of our systems? We want to make sure there's change management process involved. So these are the controls that are being mandated. And then logging, right? Logging and monitoring of the access around that customer information. Who has access to it? Are those logs being reviewed, right? So one of the sort of cardinal sins of logging is that you're institutionally logging all of that access. What is Drumm working on? What has he downloaded? Who is he interacting with? But nobody's reviewing it, right? So you have to have both the logging capability and the monitoring to go back and be able to say, yes, we're regularly looking at that. And that's sort of the fourth element, is that regular testing of the controls. Are you validating at an annual occurrence that these controls are in place and they are working as intended or designed? The fifth element is around awareness and education. I like to say education versus training, especially in higher education context. Sometimes training is a dirty word to say to our faculty and our staff, but what is being mandated is that the individuals that are interacting with that Department of Education customer information are appropriately trained and have awareness of the risk around protecting that PII. Can't get away from vendor management. The sixth element is around vendor management, right? So that is that third-party risk and vendor management, making sure that we have a program and process around it, making sure that we're regularly testing all of those things. So that continues. And then incident response planning. We tend to want to not bury our head in the sands, but say that it'll never happen to us. That's somebody else's problem. What this mandates is having a prescriptive plan for how you will work through an incident, reporting who those folks that are really involved in the incident, having that written plan, and then testing that plan, right? Regularly validating is the plan working, right? And learning to doing lessons learned from that. And then sort of lastly, sort of takes us back to the first element, right? So we have that qualified individual. We've named a CISO, or a person that's responsible for protecting that customer information, that student financial aid data. And we want to have that person reporting to the board and or the president or the cabinet, whatever that leadership structure is on campus, at least annually, right? So that really raises the visibility of the program to the cabinet level, to the board level, and it's a requirement. So, when we think about continuing to receive financial aid for our institutions, when they come in and they audit, they're going to look at and say, how often is the CISO briefing the board? Because there is that requirement for at least annual. So I think that's important. It does elevate the role of the CISO on campus and make sure that they're getting that visibility to leadership that is needed.
Well, I'm kind of curious with all these things. That mean there's a lot of requirements, and they all make sense to me. Who's going to be doing the evaluation that these are done properly? Is this going to fall on the accreditor?
Typically, Department of Education will audit some number of institutions annually. They obviously don't have the means to do it for everyone. So typically, it's a self-assessment that the institutions would do themselves. They can also contract with third parties, consultancies to come in and do. One of the things that the company I'm with now has been doing over the last 6 months is helping higher eds sort of prepare a readiness for, are you compliant with these standards that took effect in early June 2023? So they can outsource that and have a consultant. I found in my experience as a CISO at my time at Quinnipiac, it was always helpful to have that third party come in and do it. It helped facilitate it. Sometimes your colleagues are more apt to be transparent with the third party than they might be with you. There's a whole list of psychology reasons why you do that, but it does also, from a compliance perspective, certainly checks a box when you have a third party compliance firm come in and make sure that you're meeting that standard.
So it's going to be random testing, basically.
Yeah, I think it'll be either event-driven from the Department of Education where there was an incident and then they're going to come out and do an audit, or it will just be a random where they're doing a subset of institutions annually.
Well, it does make me wonder, and I bring up the accreditation again. The department has delegated to the accreditation bodies the assessment of quality with respect to federal financial aid. And it makes me wonder if they're going to start adding something onto the accreditation to whether they go through a HECVAT type assessment, bring in a third party, et cetera.
Yeah, I think it might be part of the program participation agreement. You may see some language change in that when they're onboarding, or part of, as you said, part of the accreditation. Government-wide, there's another sort of acronym, the CMMC model, the Cybersecurity Capability Maturity Model, which is very much focused on Department of Defense currently. If you're, applicability to higher ed is specific to those large R1s that are doing potential DoD work. The longer term play is, will that model, that CMMC sort of accreditation model, be adopted by FSA or other departments, other areas within the government as the standard for vetting, to your point, the accreditation of, are you meeting the standard? For many years, it was a self-assessment. The institution would do the self-assessment and then say to the government, we've done our self-assessment and we meet the standard. Where CMMC is sort of moving the needle is, it's sort of show us your homework, right? It's the accreditation piece of, when I ask my high school age son if he's done his homework, he always says yes. And then when I ask, can I see it? He's always, Dad, I'll be back in a couple hours. He's got to go do it. So, I think that sort of, to your point, moving from sort of that self-assessment to more of an accreditation model is, moving institutions from saying they're compliant to showing that they're compliant is probably where we're headed.
And that makes a lot of sense. When we started off, we talked a little bit about the importance of having a CISO, but prior to coming on the air, we were talking about how few CISOs there are. You mentioned something about 750,000 jobs available there in the cyber world.
Yeah, so not at the CISO level, but there is openings, and I'll send you the links. Cyberseek.org is a website that tracks the availability of open positions nationally. So what we're seeing is sort of a workforce gap at all levels, right? So up to and through the CISO level. Some of the CISOs are my age or older. We're getting near retirement, mid to late 50s. So how are we moving through in cultivating and mentoring and developing the, sort of mid-management workforce? And then also, how are we bringing in more youth, more diversity into our ranks? So one of the things here so I'm based in Connecticut, still live in Connecticut. The state of Connecticut recently kicked off an initiative called the CT Cyber Hub, which is really designed to provide a pipeline for that talent, working with academic institutions in the state of Connecticut. So small state, there's 24 higher ed institutions in the state of Connecticut, 12 are community colleges, there's 4 state university system colleges, the flagship University of Connecticut. Then we have schools like Yale and Quinnipiac and Sacred Heart and Fairfield and a number of private institutions. And what this does is really provides a framework for those institutions that have cybersecurity curriculum and students that are in their institutions to have a pathway for work. If you think back to other trades where there was journeyman, apprentice programs that coincide with sort of a academic setting, now you have an applied learning setting where the Cyber Hub will allow for internships, for jobs, partnering both with those higher ed institutions, but with employers in the state of Connecticut at large. We're known for insurance here in the state of Connecticut and some defense contracting as well. Those employers are sort of signing on to be the beneficiary of the output of these programs, both by providing internships. So the students that come through the programs are actually getting hands-on applied learning skills, doing the internships, doing the work at those employers. And the employers are getting to vet and see those students in that potential workforce. So I'm excited about the Cyber Hub. I think it's a model that can scale nationally to sort of help that workforce gap, the skills gap, and bring in not only diversity, but young talent, different ways of thinking into the career field. As I said, if you go to conferences, if you look around and we think about cybersecurity, it's a lot of older people. So how do we continue to bring new people into the career field?
Well, I think that's a great thing. And I think this is probably going to be a model that other states and other state university systems can emulate.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And there's a company called IQ4 that is helping sort of behind the scenes with the state of Connecticut that has sort of, to your point, that repeatable model that can sort of be brought to other states. I think they're looking at Rhode Island. I want to say they've done some work in New York State already. So there's some traction around this. The thing about higher ed is we have that talent. So even as when I was the CISO at Quinnipiac, being able to leverage the students, a lot of times, he said, the institution might have a chief information security officer, but at best, when I was at Quinnipiac, I was the CISO and I had 1 or 2 full-time employees, right? And I think that is probably the standard for a lot of our higher ed institutions. They might have that named person. They may not have a ton of full-time employees behind them, but being able to leverage that student talent that we have and the academic programs around cybersecurity within our own institution. So we're seeing a lot of models around that as well within higher ed. I know Cal Poly has a program where they're using their students to manage their security operations center. So it's helping them go back to that continuous monitoring and that logging that we talked about as compliance for the Department of Education and the GLBA requirements, but they're able to staff that with students, which gives the students real world experience. And it helps the institution because now you have resources to address some of those control requirements without having to budget and fund for those.
That's a great thing. And it gives students credit as far as their degree programs.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So it's a win-win.
That's fabulous. I knew this was going to happen, Brian. We're at the end of our time already. So if you would, please, 3 takeaways for higher ed presidents and boards.
I always say, go out and talk to that CISO, make sure you're engaging with your chief information security officer. It's a two-way street. So I always encourage that. Paying attention to third-party risk, as we've talked about, it's something that is a board level concern and not just IT. And just being aware, right? Just being aware and engaged and being a supporter and knowing that this is an institutional issue. And I think most presidents and boards are aware that cyber is a board issue. It's not an IT issue or a CISO issue, that this is an institutional issue. So, and I think it's huge as we move through this.
I think you're right. I'm going to add 2 more to that from a board's perspective is 1, make sure you've got the expertise on the board who understands that, at least one person who may be a CISO, may understand IT, etc. Most boards don't have that. The second one is your risk committee needs to be fully engaged with this type of thing, because if they're not, you're opening yourself for hacks or even worse.
Right. The risk committee is a huge call out. And I see where, that's one of the things we didn't talk about in detail, but you do see higher ed now including sort of that holistic enterprise risk management, where cyber risk is part of that conversation around institutional risk at that risk committee level. So great call out.
Thank you. So Brian, what's next for you? I mean, you've left EDUCAUSE, you're working with another firm. You haven't got any gray hair that I can see.
Yeah, I think there's days where, what's next might be mowing lawns or something that doesn't involve a computer, but it's I think every day is a challenge, and it's exciting to know that we're helping, right? I think that's part of my military background and just that service, as I enjoy helping clients, customers in higher ed, that's where I've spent the last 17 years. So I do lean heavily toward higher ed, and I think I'll probably still be in that environment helping those members.
Well, not to sound trite, but thank you for your service to the community. I always enjoy our conversations. I learned so much, so thank you.
Likewise. Great to see you again.
And you too. Take care.
Thanks.
Thanks for listening today, and a special thank you to Brian Kelly for sharing his insights with us on what higher education institutions can do to deal with the mounting cyber risks confronting them. Tune in next week for my talk with David Linton, author and economist, who'll be sharing with us the insights he learned about higher education and student debt while researching and writing his newest book, Crushed: How Student Debt Has Impaired a Generation and What to Do About It. Thanks again for listening. See you next week.
Changing Higher Ed is a production of The Change Leader, a consultancy committed to transforming higher ed institutions. Find more information about this topic, along with show notes on this episode, at changinghighered.com. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please subscribe to the show, and we would also value your honest rating and review. Email any questions, comments, or recommendations for topics or guests to podcast@changinghighered.com. Changing Higher Ed is produced and hosted by Dr. Drumm McNaughton, post-production by David L. White.